Morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and this is going to be the first video about the Laxdæla saga, the saga of the people of Laxardal, as part of Sagalong 2020. So Sagalong is a read-along of the Laxdæla saga and several other sagas hosted by a whole range of people, most of whom have already posted their video because it was due to come out yesterday. So the advantage that I have of being quite late to post this video is that I've already seen those videos and I can kind of like pick something different to talk about because there is so much to talk about in here. That you could actually honestly talk for hours. And I'm thinking of it as a little bit like an English essay where you could talk for hours and hours about a book, but if you want to do well in your essay, you have to pick something really small and focused to talk about in order to like have something useful to say in a short word count. So I'm trying to restrict the length of this video, and I'm going to talk about shipwrecks and problems on board ships, as opposed to all of the many things that you could possibly talk about. But to start off with a bit of a general introduction, the other hosts of the Sagalong read-along, the ones that have already posted videos so far are Elizabeth at Bookish North, Lukash at Totally Pretentious, Mark at Richardson Reads, Elena Macridina, Steve Donahue, and Jason, the two people who haven't posted videos yet as well, Jason at Byways in Bookland and Michael McGrath. So you can go to any of them for their videos as well. They are particularly fascinating videos about this saga. We've all been saying that there is such a wealth of stuff to say, even in such a tiny work. Yeah, it's fascinating. So what is the Laxdæla saga, to start out with? This is the introduction to the essay. So it's a family saga about the descendants of a woman called the Deep-Minded, but it is also a neighbourhood saga. It's a saga about the people who live in the area called Laxardal, the valley of the valley of the salmon-filled river is how I translated it in my introduction video for Sagalong. And it's about the interactions that people have with their neighbours in this tiny space. I think Lukash compared it to a western, and various people have said that it has this kind of, in comments as well, that it has this kind of frontier feel. In my head, as I was reading it, I was comparing it more to EastEnders, because I don't watch EastEnders, but it's a story about a group of people who live in very close proximity, who have multiple historical ties with one another, and tensions that you can't quite remember why these families don't get along, but there is a reason. And there is a little bit of historical conflict there, or there is a historical loyalty. So yeah, all of these families have a great deal of baggage and background between them, which is part of what is being set up in this first half of the saga. As Steve Donahue says in his video, most of what we think of as the plot of this saga happens in the second half. I've never read it before, so I don't really know so much about what that plot is, but I'm looking forward to getting into like the deeper side, and this is like an extended setup, but it is a fascinating setup as well. So it reminds me of EastEnders, but I think in the modern day it would adapt very well to being like a Netflix show, like a kind of a multi-series show with a great deal of character development. There's multiple different plot lines. You have one story is unfolding and then it'll say, oh, at the same time, this person had now come of age and went off on this voyage. So it would lend itself to that kind of like interlocking storylines type thing that you can see. You can really see someone just adapting it, but they'd have to adapt it quite heavily because they'd have to put a lot more meat in it. It's quite a bare bones kind of story. A lot of the sagas are. One thing that, even though it is bare bones, the thing that I love about the saga, and many sagas, is that some characters really jump out and some characters are really well developed, and there are no kind of like black and white characters. Well, there are actually. There's some characters that are quite simplistic. One excellent example of that is a man called Hrap, who is basically everyone's worst neighbour, and a bit like EastEnders or that kind of soap show, he dies and then he comes back because he's that much of a horrible neighbour. He comes back and haunts people who live on his land. I think that's just fascinating and brilliant. And he's a very like corporeal ghost as well. He can physically break people's weapons in kind of like something that reminded me of like an idea of impotence. He grabs a man's spear and snaps it. It's kind of got its implications there. That actually reminded me of a ballad called, I think it's called the Sussex Ballad, where it's very similar. Somebody haunts somebody else, and then they go and they dig up his body and they find the thing that like a physical item that he has captured on his haunting in the grave. I'll see if I can link to a video of that ballad down below. So anyway, yeah, so they have this huge range, and the start of this saga has a massive range of scenes of domesticity. We've got like a brilliant anecdote of like a baby falling out of a cradle and somebody being like, oh, you know, couldn't help the baby fall out of the cradle, and then like the next sentence, that baby is a grown up. So like little moments of domesticity that are captured, and then moments of, like I've said, hauntings, or moments of quite pronounced conflict, and moments of like legal complexities. And it's all about like this kind of genealogy and this setup and so on. In terms of nuanced characters, I just wanted to give a brief shout out to my favourite character, which has got to be a woman called Jorunn, who is the wife of Hoskuld. And Hoskuld then goes and gets another, not a wife, but he gets a slave woman called Melkorka, who turns out to be this the daughter of an Irish king, so she has this kind of status. And Jorunn is my favourite character because every scene that she's in, she's always just pulling out these little witty sentences, witty one-liners, and Hoskuld comes back and he's like, oh, would you believe I don't even know this woman's name? And she, I'll see if I can find it. I know roughly where it is. You probably think I'm mocking you, but I do not know her name. Jorunn said, unless the stories I've heard are lies, you must have spoken to her enough to have at least asked her name. And she's like referring to the fact that they've obviously been having an affair, and obviously Melkorka goes on to have a son by, what was his name? Hoskuld. So yeah, so I love Jorunn because she has all of these like catty, witty little sentences that she goes about having, and like little feisty conflicts between her and Melkorka. But then she's also a diplomat. This is what I mean about characters. The important characters are nuanced. Like, she also prevents conflict between Hoskuld and his brother Hrut. So yeah, it's interesting the different facets of personalities that come across in these sagas. But I said I was going to talk about shipwrecks, and I've already just gone on for 7 minutes about things other than shipwrecks. So this is my Viking ship. I made it in pottery. It is incredibly heavy and incredibly hideous. It really didn't come out the way that it was supposed to. But it's a little bit wrecked because it broke in the firing. So we're going to talk about ships that didn't quite do what they were supposed to do. Because we have this impression of the Vikings, or the people of Iceland who created these sagas, as being these seafaring, like amazing seafarers, and they went to America and they went to and from Iceland and Norway and the Faroe Isles and Ireland, like all the time. But they did sometimes make mistakes, and this book is full of mistakes and accidents on ships. They keep cropping up. So it starts quite early on, and it starts as part of the sort of foundation story for the people of Laxardal. So I've already mentioned this woman called Unn the Deep-Minded, and she was one of the first members of her family to arrive in Iceland and to claim land there. But she actually arrives via a shipwreck. So Unn then made ready to leave the Faroe Islands and told her sailing companions that she intended to sail to Iceland. With her she took Olaf Phelan, Thorstein the Red Son, and his sisters who were still unmarried. She set sail and had a smooth journey, making land at Hvikrastad on the south shore. The ship was wrecked upon landing, but all those aboard survived and managed to save their property. I see that as really symbolic. So Unn arrives in this land where she is going to found a dynasty, effectively. And the first thing that happens is her ship is wrecked. Like, I was thinking, is this a bad omen? But actually, I think it's more symbolic in a good way. Her ship wrecks at Laxardal, so she sets up she founds her family land at Laxardal. There's also a reference to like they would put these wood things into the water that would float to the shore, and where the wood things landed, that would be a symbol of where they ought to live. And this is also, they find them, finding that her high seat pillars had floated ashore there, she felt it was clear that this was where she should make her home. And that is a way of determining like where you should then go and live. But she arrives and her shipwreck, so it's a real sign of this is where she should stay, and this is where she and her family will stay, like, ongoingly. So I like that as like a sense of finality of this is our land and this is where we are going to be from now on. There's going to be no more of this like nomadic lifestyle of going from Una's already so far in her life started out in Norway, moved to Scotland, moved to the Faroe Islands. She's had this very transient life, and now her ship has wrecked. She has got to stay in Laxdæla. So yeah, I thought that was quite cool. So moving on to the next shipwreck. What's it going to be? And it is a man called Thorstein. I'm not going to read this one out because it's quite a long scene, really. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. I admit that I can't remember which Thorstein this is. And I looked in my version has got this family tree that says it's family ties in Laxardal, and it's actually caused me more confusion than it has helped with, because it only mentions what it considers to be the important characters, which aren't all of the characters that appear. The cat is standing on the chair that the phone is attached to, so sorry if the screen shakes about a little bit. See if she wants to come and join us. There we go. There we go, little cat. Yes, I couldn't work out who Thorstein was when I was reviewing this, ready to talk about it. And he sets out because he wants to move to some land that he's inherited at Hrapstadir in Laxdæla. So it's the land that used to belong to this demonic ghost guy, Hrap. I can't really work out how you're supposed to say Hrap, but that's the idea of his name, H-R-A-P-P. So Thorstein and 11 others boarded a ferry, and they get stuck in this current, which apparently the name translates as the coal chest current, and it's described as the most dangerous of the Breiðafjord currents. And things get worse and worse as they're going on through this journey, and it's a very detailed description of what goes on inside the boat, and how they're steering the boat. Somebody is physically wearing the straps to control the rudder. I don't know whether that was a normal thing, but it's really beautiful and detailed about this boat that is loaded up with chests and belongings and then becomes stranded. And while they're stranded, this seal comes and it swims around the boat. I haven't worked out what this seal is symbolic of, but they try to kill it and they can't. So it's like it's a thing that gets away from them. And then finally, the tide began to come in. When it had reached the point where the ship was about to float free, a great storm struck, which capsized the ship. Everyone aboard was drowned except one man, who managed to make his way to shore, holding on to a bit of wood. His name was Gudmund, and the islands where he landed have since been called Gudmundareja, or the islands of Gudmund. And then it gets on to this very detailed, legally complex discussion of who then has the rights to that property, because this guy Thorstein, who died, was a very important man, and he had various members of his family on board his ship, and they had a very sophisticated legal system governing inheritance. And this one poor man who survived this shipwreck gets to land, and the first thing that people are worried about, after they've named some islands after him, which I suppose is nice, is like who died first, and he has to remember the order in which people died in order to determine who should inherit the land, which is brilliant, because then he ends up contradicting himself, and he says that one person died first, and then the next time he talks about it he says that another person died first. So it goes to somebody being tested by an ordeal, which is a fascinating tiny detail of the legal system, where if there wasn't like a clear story, somebody had to do something to prove their right, which is this very medieval idea of, like it's like a witch having to not float on water or something. People sometimes had to hold red hot pokers and not get burned, and in this case he has to walk under, this man called Thorkel has to walk under an arch of turf without the turf breaking, and this is obviously something that, a bit like not being burned by red hot iron, it's obviously going to struggle to happen successfully. So he arranges for somebody to trip up and break the arch so that no one can say whether it was his fault that it broke or whether it was because of this dispute. And even though it's completely like trumped up and it's obviously fake, basically, he is granted the rights to that land because of that incident with the turf arch. And my book has got a a little bit at the conclusion about the social, political and legal structure, and I think it is written by somebody called Kristjansdottir, but the other author of the book, or the translator, is Keneva Kunz, so it might be him as well, and he says, such actions are evidence of the weaknesses in the social structure where the executive authority was not sufficiently strong enough to enforce the law. And I find that really interesting. Like, they have an advanced legal system, but they also can't quite back it up. And it's almost like they don't have an interest in backing it up because they all want to be able to contravene the law when it suits them. So they like having this structure, but they also like to be able to manipulate it as well. I've noticed that I'm 15 minutes in and that is getting a little bit long. So let's move on to the next bit of Shipwreck. Yeah, so I just found it really interesting the way that that shipwreck, which must be a relatively regular occurrence, like it must happen from time to time, led to quite a pronounced dispute for quite some time. So the next situation where a ship gets into trouble and doesn't do exactly what it's supposed to, is with Olaf and his skipper Orn. And Olaf is the daughter of Hoskuld and Melkorka, and Melkorka has sent him back to Ireland to talk to the King of Ireland and prove that he's his grandson. And Olaf's on his boat with Orn. They've set out from, where were they before? Somebody called Harold and Gunhild in Norway, and they've set out to sail to Ireland, and they don't know the way. So they're disputing and they're arguing, and they've all got a different opinion, and they're like, well, who should decide? And in the end, Olaf says, let the man of best judgment determine our course. The council of fools is the more misguided, the more of them there are. So they take this decision, quite sensibly, to just stick with one person's opinion rather than continuing to argue about which way to go. Unfortunately, the man they decide, Orn, doesn't do a very good job, and he winds up he gets them to Ireland, but he gets them stuck on like a clay bank under the sea. So they are stranded within reach of Ireland, but not able to like make land safely. And this puts them in a very difficult position because they know that the Irish are potentially a little bit hostile to strangers. And Orn says, I'm afraid we won't be well received. We're far from any port or merchant town where foreigners are assured of trading in peace, and now the tide has gone out and left us stranded here like a minnow. It's my guess that, according to Irish law, they'll claim all the property we have on board. They'll call it a stranded ship when less than this has ebbed off the stern of the ship. Olaf said they would come to no harm. And Olaf is right in the end. They're able to negotiate purely because Olaf speaks Irish, and he's able to kind of like, he stands up there in all of his gold gleaming battle regalia and starts speaking to them in Irish, and the Irish people that meet them are completely confused and befuddled, and they go and get their king, and then Olaf is reunited with his grandfather. And it interests me the way that Olaf and his grandfather meet, like across this patch of sea, and you have to wonder whether that was necessary for their peaceful meeting, like whether Olaf coming in a situation where he's kind of in the king's power and he's not a threat, whether that helps him to then strike up this quite strong relationship that he does have with his grandfather. Yeah, and I just found it quite funny, the way that they're trying really hard to get to Ireland and then they wind up just sort of stranded. And I find these moments where ships are getting stuck are moments of higher tension, because it's like what is going to happen next is much more unpredictable, because it's not just about how people will behave, it's about how the weather will behave as well. So it's like this idea of like maybe an intervening power or a system that is not under the character's control having a huge influence on what's going to happen. The last shipwreck, and I'm 19 minutes in, I feel like I'm going to have the longest video. The last shipwreck is slightly different, and this is my favourite shipwreck. So a woman called Thurid, who is a daughter of Olaf that we've just been talking about, is basically pressured into marrying a man called Geirmund. And Geirmund is not everybody's best friend. He's quite unpredictable, he's quite unpleasant, and he actually only gets to come to Iceland by sneaking on to somebody else's ship, to Olaf's ship. And Olaf wasn't happy about that, but because of kind of rules of I suppose rules of hospitality, even applying to ships, he's like, I can't run you off my ship like a stray dog, so I've got to carry you to Iceland, which seems a bit backwards, like somebody that he really doesn't want to bring into contact with his family, he then becomes obliged to bring into contact with his family, and that results in his daughter being married to him. And Geirmund is known for having this sword that he really loves, and he never lets it out of his reach, and he keeps it by him all the time. So Geirmund and Thurid have a daughter called Groa, and before Groa is a year old, Geirmund decides that he's bored of his life with Olaf and Thurid and so on, and he is going to go off and sail away. And Olaf makes Geirmund the present of a merchant ship, which seems counterintuitive, but I suppose if you want to get rid of somebody, then it makes sense to give them a ship. And Thurid is quite annoyed that her dad is not able to get Geirmund to stay, because I suppose now that she's married to him, she kind of needs him for protection and for help bringing up her daughter. So Geirmund sets off. He made ready and sailed from the mouth of the Laxar River on a light northeasterly breeze, but the wind died as they reached the islands. The ship lay at anchor off Oxney for a fortnight without gaining a favourable wind for departure. And at this point, Thurid gets her act together and starts doing things for herself, and she's another character that I love. There's a theme in this story where the women are really determined and feisty, which I love. So she gets a group of companions together, she gets herself a ship, and she sails out towards the place where Geirmund is stranded in the middle of the night, and she sabotages their boat so that they won't be able to pursue her. And then she goes, sorry, this is a spoiler if you haven't read it already, and then she goes and she swaps the sword for the baby. And so instead of Geirmund having his sword that he loves so much that he always keeps by him, when he wakes up and realises there's a problem, he goes to grab his sword and oh my god, he's holding a baby. It's quite comical. Just the idea of this warrior being stranded with this baby, and he kind of shouts after her, he's like, please take the baby away. So the child soon began to cry and woke Geirmund. He sat up and, recognising his daughter, suspected who was behind all of this. Jumping to his feet, he reached for his sword, only to find it gone, as might be expected. Running up on deck, he saw Thurid and her companions rowing their boat away. Take your daughter with you, and whatever wealth you want. Thurid said, do you mind the loss of your sword so much? Geirmund replied, I'd have to lose a great deal of money before I minded it as much as the loss of that sword. And she said, then you will never have it, as you have treated me dishonourably in more ways than one. This will be the last you'll see of me. Geirmund then spoke, that sword will bring you no luck. I lay this curse upon it, that it will be the death of that man in your family who will be most missed and least deserve it. I don't know whether this sword is going to come up again later in the saga. I feel like it probably should. Because, it's got a curse on it now, so that makes it an important sword. However, later in this chapter, it's very short and simplistic and simple, and sometimes episodes in this saga are just so condensed and they just happen. A favourable wind arose, and Geirmund and his men sailed out to sea, making land in Norway that autumn. One night they ran around on rocks near Stad, and Geirmund and all aboard were drowned. The baby is still on board that ship. So that makes me think whether the loved and least deserved person who's killed as a result of this sword is in a way the baby, because they definitely don't deserve to be killed. So I found that quite sad, but also quite interesting. So that is Shipwrecks in the Saga of the People of Laxardal so far. I have only read up to chapter 30, 31, or wherever. Basically where I just stopped there is where I have read up to. But next week I will try to have finished the saga and we will discuss the rest of it. There is so much depth and richness and complexity to these sagas. They can be hard going at times because there are loads of different names and loads of different families and details and things to keep track of. But it is really, really worth it, and I would highly recommend reading this and just kind of skimming over the bits that are a little bit more heavy going and focusing in on these exciting dramatic episodes or the entertaining episodes. So yeah, highly recommend this book. I highly recommend as well checking out the videos by the other co-hosts, and I will speak to you next week for more Sagalong joy. Bye bye.